Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation here on the Tattooed Historians Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn page. I really appreciate everyone hanging out with us. We're across 4 different platforms tonight, and I'm really excited about that. Thank you to everybody for joining tonight, and don't forget that please remember that we have many more live streams coming later this week that I'm very excited about, and I hope that you will join in to the conversation. And anytime that you place something into the comments, we're going to be able to see that. If you place some questions in there as we go along, I may be able to drag those over onto the screen so that myself and the person I'm going to interview tonight, the VIP, will be able to see your comments and questions, and we'll be able to go from there. As you know, I run this like a discussion. This isn't so much of an interview as it is a discussion, like we're sitting in a coffee shop and having a talk about each presentation. So tonight I am so excited to be bringing back my wonderful friend, my dear friend, Steve Phan, Chief of Interpretation at Camp Nelson National Memorial. Steve, how are you doing, buddy?
I'm good, my friend. Good to see you, John. It's always a pleasure to join you, my friend. I know we were just talking before this thing started that, wow, it's been 2 years since obviously the pandemic started. And, well, you were kind of the lead on doing a lot of these virtual programs. And so it feels like a lifetime ago, but it's always good to connect with you. I guess the last time we did this, I was in Washington, D.C. And so now I'm in a brand new part of a country at a brand new National Park Service unit. So always a pleasure to be with you, my friend.
Yeah, man, it's been a while. And just like you said, 2020 seems like 10 years ago. And our concept of time has totally changed.
Oh, definitely. And it's hard to imagine that 2 years have passed. Obviously, I think people have experienced so much, good and bad, of course. The world's changed in many ways, right? But I think having these really important, pertinent conversation is what the Tattooed Historian is all about, right? That's what we do as historians. And so looking forward to chatting tonight. I know I've always enjoyed our conversations. I actually was just kind of going through my phone and I saw the photo of us at Gary Owen when we were kind of chatting for that one time, So,
yeah.
Oh my gosh, that was, what was that, like 2018, I think? Maybe 2019?
That was 19.
That was 19. Okay.
Yeah.
But oh my gosh, it goes by quick. And so I guess one of the things I do really appreciate about technology is, I've always actually been a Droid user, but the past couple of years I've had this iPhone and it always pops up memories. Me, I take a lot of photos, right. So it's kind of funny to see these photos pop up over the past several years. And there's several of us as we've of me and you as we kind of cross paths and work together at different sites. So. Well, here I am in Lexington, Kentucky, about 20 miles north, of Camp Nelson National Monument.
That's awesome. Your journey has been amazing, if I dare say so. You talk about my brand and what we've done. I'm thinking about what you've done. You've done some amazing things, and you've helped bring history to life and make it accessible for hundreds and thousands of people, honestly. And you've touched so many people through that historical curiosity. You've hit that button so many times with people, and that's why I admired you, and I still do. Obviously, it's one of those things that you did that in Washington, and now you're transferring that to a new duty location. What was it like for you with your experience in the defenses of Washington and then transferring out there, or transferring your knowledge and your know-how of how to reach new people out there to Kentucky?
Well, that's a really great question, my friend. And, I think I know I'm sure a lot of viewers are our friends, our colleagues that have hung out with us on battlefields and different places like that. Mm-hmm. We're friends on social media. I'll tell you, John, it was a hard decision to leave Washington, D.C. As you know, I think as a lot of the viewers know, I love my time in the defenses of Washington. It was an incredible experience to really help build that regional program up, get people interested and excited about the defenses of Washington. It had to be a special place for me to leave D.C., right? Obviously, the food, the culture, the diversity, it was just a special place. And then history-wise, I love being an hour and a half away from Gettysburg and Antietam and close to Richmond and all these Civil War sites and historic sites around us. But I was kind of ready for a new challenge as well, right? And I think you're right. You made this great point. My experience with the defenses, imagine, we do have those earthworks still around, these cultural resources. But for me, especially in an urban landscape like DC, a lot of the forts were gone, but the stories were still there, right? And it was really about engaging the community on these stories. I always talk about those layers of history underneath the surface, especially of a modern landscape, right? And so that was kind of my focus with the Defenses of Washington, was really engaging in the stories. And I'll say this as well, John. Obviously we had the Battle of Fort Stevens in DC, the light 2-day battle in July of '64. But we also had like 4 years of intense, like complicated human interaction that was the Civil War in Washington, D.C. And that's what we have at Camp Nelson as well. And so when I had the opportunity to be on a detail here, actually, as the chief of inter, the first chief of inter from January up until January to May of last year, we're literally forging a new path, a new beginning for this National Park Service unit. And the national significance of this site is the African American experience. A lot of the stuff I did in DC, so I thought it was a really good fit. I'm glad I came out here for 4 months. This was a county site, by the way, John, for about 20 years. So there's been a lot of work done here. Wow. Jessamine County, this is where the park is at. It's in Nicholasville, which is in Jessamine County. They've basically run this as a county site for about 20 years. They built the visitor center and another like library. That's a replicated barracks, U.S. military barracks. They put the trail system in, the interpretive waysides. The chief historian here actually he's actually become a really good friend of mine, and he's an archaeologist by trade. His name is Dr. Steve McBride, and he did so much incredible work here: surveys, excavations, writing. He did all the interpretive waysides and the museum exhibits. Right, he's become really one of my mentors and great friends, but he's also been a great support system, support reference person for the park. And so, there was already a foundation built here. So when this became a national parks unit in 2018, we've been here really since 2020 when full-time staff was on hand to kind of build it up from there, right? Mm-hmm. And so can you imagine building a brand new national park site that's a Civil War site in Kentucky, which had very, it was conditionally tied to the Union, but supported slavery, right? There were just so many complexities in Kentucky that I thought it was a great fit to come here. And we're a very small park with a small staff, but we've got big ideas and we've got very inspired people. So that experience in DC, I think, is provided me with the tools and kind of insight to do the same thing in Kentucky. I know obviously it's a different place, but we're still trying to share these stories.
That's amazing. And you're building the reputation of this park, this brand new park, in the middle of a pandemic. And that had to be a challenge in itself, because those who already have the foundational deals already done, like an Antietam or like somewhere like that, they've already been known. This is a brand new park as of 2018. Under the National Park Service auspices. And then 2020, like you say, when you're going full bore, and then all of a sudden we get slammed with the pandemic. Did that push you to do, you've already done this at DC, but did that push you to do even more as far as online outreach for the park? Because we have this kind of, for a while, we weren't even physically together, and now you have to think about things in a different way.
Yeah, definitely, John. And just kind of like what you do, we're on 4 different platforms tonight, right? And so you can imagine when I got here in January, there was only 4 Park Service staff on hand, and 2 were permanent, including the superintendent. But me and the facility manager, we were on detail, so we were only here temporarily, right? Temporarily. And so one of the things that we talk about all the time at the park is building capacity, right? And so at that point, the visitor center wasn't open yet. As I said, there was a visitor center here because we didn't have any staff, and we were also renovating the building as well. So it's interesting you asked that, right? Because, you being a Civil War historian, and I had all my colleagues and friends are like, man, you get to talk about all these stories. What type of programs are you developing at Camp Nelson? I'm like, we're actually just like trying to put new bathrooms in right now, right? New toilets, right? We literally, there was a wall when you first walked into the visitor center. We took the wall down, put a brand new front desk in, right? And it was really cool to make that decision, even with the front desk, right? Because that was like the concentration point, the focal point when people walk into the visitor center. Mm-hmm. And we had an option of making it like spending a certain amount of money on it, and it wouldn't have been the best quality. And they were like, let's spend the money, right? Because we know we're making foundational decisions that will affect the park for decades, right? And so we understand, so we kind of thought about that, like, yeah, let's make this right, So new front desk and, painted the walls, put in hardwood floors. And my big thing, John, I had to hire staff. And so when I was on here for 4 months last year, my big thing was hiring staff. We hired a permanent park ranger, and then I hired like 3 or 4 interns, if I recall. And the funny thing is, ironically, they started after I went back to DC. So I left in May when my detail was over. And you can imagine, I kind of had like hardcore FOMO, I was totally missing out. I'm like, oh my gosh, we helped, bringing these people in. And the visitor center reopened in mid-June and I wasn't there. But obviously it was a very proud moment for all of us. And we've just building it from there. But that said, John, I think you make a great point. I was able to do other things while I was there. Obviously, we're hiring staff and making these decisions about the visitor center, but kind of doing outreach as well, right? And so, we had these youth organizations come in and do volunteer work within the park, including earthwork restoration, which I'm really excited about, of course. There are a system of earthworks here. And then I launched the Facebook page and the beginning of February of 2020 and kind of watched that grow from there. And then we also did a really cool collaborative video. There were 15 U.S. Army regiments organized at Camp Nelson, John, 8 African-American United States colored troops, 7 white regiments, mostly from Kentucky and East Tennessee. But we wanted to do a really unique program, a virtual video, right? Following the footsteps of the 114th and the 116th USCT, because they go from Camp Nelson to serving in Virginia with the Army of the James. So they're around Petersburg, they're around Richmond, and one of them, the 116th, is involved in the Appomattox campaign and will be there on April 9th when Lee surrenders his army, right? And so listen to this. We did we started at Camp Nelson, and then we went to Richmond National Battlefield Park. So we had one of our colleagues shoot a video there, a part of the video there, and then we went to Petersburg National Battlefield. And so, we had a couple Rangers do some things there. And then we ended at Appomattox Courthouse. So we incorporated 4 parks in one video, right? Wow. So it was kind of one of our, as you mentioned, John, these parks are well known and well established, right? And so we wanted to kind of cling on to their name and their popularity, and say it kind of build our name up as well. So one of the big things I'm working on, John, and our staff is, and I think about this all the time, is branding. You get this with your career, with the things that you've done with the Tattooed Historian. It's really interesting. Even in the Civil War kind of world, not a lot of people know about Camp Nelson, right? Even me, I knew a little bit about it, but I just didn't know how complex and dynamic this site was from a military logistical standpoint, operational command and control, but also obviously the refugee experience, the African-American experience, emancipation, all that stuff. But here, there's a national cemetery right behind, south of the park, and it's called Camp Nelson National Cemetery. And it's directly connected to the military camp. It was actually started during the Civil War at Camp Nelson. So it's a part of the original camp. And it's interesting, though, when we get calls during the week, people ask for the cemetery, right? Not knowing that that's actually run by the VA and our site's run by the National Park Service. So that's one of our big things, John, is branding. We want people to know that it's a national park site in central Kentucky and that there's other sites around as well that do the Civil War. So even newer park, which is about an hour and a half south of us, is Mill Springs Battlefield National Monument. And they literally have a superintendent and like a lot of part-time staff. And so they're really still building. They're behind us. And there's more established parks like Abraham Lincoln Birthplace, which is another national park site. So those are the 3 big national park sites. But there's also Richmond Battlefield, Perryville Battlefield, Munfordville. There's a lot of stuff in Lexington. Mary Todd Lincoln's house that she grew up is here. Her family's buried in the cemetery in Lexington, right? So I see this, John, as like a Civil War corridor, kind of heritage area, very similar to Virginia, the Carolinas, parts of the South. Kentucky's always kind of been on the periphery of the Civil War, but I think it's our goal across the state to really amplify the profile of these sites.
Yeah, and it sounds like one of the major keys to the development of the site has been something I've been preaching for years, which is collaboration.
Absolutely.
And you're not taking visitors away from anywhere else. You're working with others to make sure they go to both sites or 4 sites or whatever to get the whole experience.
Yeah, and that's the big thing with us as well, John. And so we've made it really a focus of ours to go out and do outreach with the community, like genuine connections with the community. I'll give you an example. Like today, I had an appointment earlier in the morning, but on my way down to the park, I stopped by Jessamine County Public Library because we're going to be doing some programming with them, collaborations at their site, but they're also coming out to our site as well. So we will be at the Black History program they have next the following Saturday. But we also are thinking about doing a genealogy research day at the park, and they've got this mobile like library van that they're going to bring out there, right? And then other, because I think, we get so insular in the Park Service and people just want to work with other National Park Service sites. But, I've got to know the site manager at Richmond, and he's showed up to our winter lecture series already. He shares all of our programs, right? And vice versa. We've gotten to know the Perryville Battlefield staff, and they're managed by the state, right? So on all these levels, right? You're right, John. Collaboration, really relationship building is critically important to us. And then one of the things that we really focus on, of course, is, as I said, the African-American experience here it's nationally significant for Camp Nelson. And so we've been very proactive as much as possible, with our staffing to connect with the African-American communities around the park in Jessamine County and beyond. So I think we've had some success with that, and we'll continue to build on that moving forward.
That's awesome. It's fantastic. And I put the link in the chat, everybody, on Facebook and YouTube for the site. And please go over there and you'll see the socials at the bottom. Please follow all the socials as well. When I first heard that you were going there, and I checked out the site, or after you've been there a little while, I checked out the site. And the story is just phenomenal of this site. And there's so many different things that can be interpreted in it, through the primary source materials and through the documentation and all kinds of stuff. Tell us about the founding of the camp and what you've learned about that era from being there.
Yeah, that's a great question, John. As I said, Kentucky is such a complex place, in regards to the Civil War era, of course. It was a slaveholding state. It was a border state, as I think a lot of us know, from our understanding of the Civil War. And so it, remained in the Union. But there was a lot of military operations that happened here in 1862 that led to the biggest battle in Kentucky, which was Perryville, which was ultimately a federal victory, a tactical victory in many ways, as Bragg's army retreated from the area. But, this state is really interesting in the surrounding region, actually, because there's pro-Confederates and there's a lot of pro-Unionists, and they're living in these kind of weird zones, right? And so, Camp Nelson is established because of East Tennessee. There's a large Unionist population in East Tennessee that have been under Confederate occupation since the beginning of the war. And so the federal armies, the U.S. military, has been struggling to liberate East Tennessee. And it finally comes down to really the summer of 1863 when this happens, just a month after Gettysburg or so. The camp is established in late spring, early summer of 1863 by the U.S. Army of the Ohio, believe it or not, under the command of Ambrose Burnside, of all people, right? Yeah, he had Fredericksburg, obviously, and then he had the Mud March in January 63. And then he gets sent out to take command of the Department of the Ohio. The Army's in the field, and he actually brings his 9th Corps with him. So he's got the 9th Corps, and then they organize the 23rd Corps, which is, they've grouped up together as the Army of the Ohio. And he needs a supply base, a supply depot. And so they choose this site, John, about 20 miles south of Lexington, Kentucky, right in the middle of the bluegrass, central Kentucky. And I think if the viewers go and check out our site, you'll see different maps and things like that. Definitely check out our website, our Facebook page. We have a lot of great information on there. Mm-hmm. This was strategically chosen because of the natural defense here and the road system. It's right off the highway here. We call it US 27. It was called the Lexington Danville Turnpike. So there was a rail system from Louisville to Lexington to Nicholasville, and then they'd have to take wagons down to this new site. But it's defended on 3 sides by the Kentucky River and then Hickman Creek. And then, as I mentioned, they built some fortifications to protect the northern section of the of the camp. But John, this grows to be one of the largest supply depots in the entire country. I mean, 4,000 acres, 300 wooden structures workshops, barracks, mess halls, corrals for thousands of horses. They even had a steam-powered water pump that pumped up water 300 feet from the Kentucky River into a reservoir at the camp that held tens of thousands of acres. And then they piped it to all these workshops. It was fire suppression. It wasn't even drinking water, right? So absolutely spectacular. And the interesting thing is, Burnside comes through Camp Nelson in August of 63, and then he launches his campaign into East Tennessee. And he successfully relieves or captures Knoxville, and that will remain in federal hands until the remainder of the war. So you have that, the logistical side, as I said, the military operations side. Interestingly enough, though, truly at the beginning of the establishment of the camp is the African-American experience, because listen to this, we are in a slave state, right? Protected by the Constitution. The U.S. Army had to impress enslaved people to build road systems, expand the road system, and build fortifications at Camp Nelson. And so they compensated slaveholders for their, the use of their human property. So that was kind of the beginning. And we know hundreds, if not thousands, were involved with this. Interestingly enough, John, in 1864, we've already determined, one of my staff members did the research, about 100 at least that we know of, that we've identified, of those men returned to Camp Nelson and enlisted with the United States Colored Troops.
Wow.
So incredibly powerful, right? And I'll tell you this, John, we know about the United States Colored Troops, especially starting in 1863 after the Emancipation Proclamation, which was void and not in effect in Kentucky. But really, the forward momentum had been started, and there was a lot of resistance by Kentuckians with the enlistment of black soldiers. But by 1864, all the chips are in the middle of the table for the Lincoln administration and the War Department. And so they'll start recruiting black men here. The majority of them are enslaved from Kentucky, and over 10,000 will be organized in regiments at Camp Nelson. It's one of the largest recruitment camps for black soldiers in the entire country.
Wow. This sounds like a working city, the way this is laid out. It's probably it's probably one of the largest, if you consider it a city.
Yes.
One of the largest cities in Kentucky at that time.
Actually, it's funny you say that, because on days when there was a lot of troops here, certainly in August of 63, when the Army of the Ohio was passing through Camp Nelson, it's probably the second largest city in Kentucky after Louisville. It's funny you say that, because we do mention that in our program. And I don't think people realize the scale and scope of Camp Nelson. That's one of the things that we try to communicate and, illustrate with a lot of the images. Fortunately, there's about 45 historic images that were taken of the camp, mostly of the structures that were here, right? So we're fortunate to have that. And I'd mention, you mentioned the resource material, things that we, primary source material and things like that. Actually, our biggest resource here, John, is archaeological, because all the buildings, everything was taken down in 1866. So 95% of the park is archaeological. As I said, though, fortunately, the county had this wonderful archaeologist historian, and he did 30 years worth of research, surveys, and excavations. So we know where these sites are at, some of the things he found, including, I'm thinking about our friend Dave Wilson from Victorian Studio. So there was a large sutler shop here that he was excavating, which was really close to what we call the heart of the camp, the industrial center with all the workshops. And they ended up finding something that was not on the map. And it was a photography studio. They literally had one at the camp. And so, and we find out who this person was. Well, they determined who this person was. He was from Lexington, and he took photos of mostly soldiers, black and white soldiers, at Camp Nelson. So, we have found this stuff from the ground. And so we've determined, a lot of this from our interpretation of the cultural resources that we have found through excavations.
Wow. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Ronald's got it nailed on the head. To lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game.
Indeed.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that was the quote I was trying to think of, actually, and it didn't pop in my head quick enough. Ronald got it. With those archaeological digs, that's really fascinating to me, because I would think when they tear down, now obviously they're not going to get everything, but
sure,
when you tear down a camp like that in 1866. You're going to try to reuse some of those materials, right? Because it is, a lesser populated area, let's say, than like New York City or anything like that. So is it just you're going to look for the foundations like we usually do in archaeological digs, and then plot things out, or how do we? Are there camp maps, or you just you line up photos like we did with like Fresnito stuff?
Yeah, a little bit of everything, to be honest. And as I mentioned, we had a winter lecture series the first Saturday of the month with Dr. Stephen McBride. He, as I said, he's the archaeologist expert that's been doing all the work here, and it was incredibly fascinating. I mean, he told us stuff that none of us in the Park Service knew, and it just came from years and years of doing research, and then this field work as well. So let me give you an example in regards to the things that he was able to determine through his excavations. And so one of the cool aspects, he had this PowerPoint, and he's like, these are the questions that we're asking, and we're hoping to determine and answer these questions by doing our surveys, right? And so I have to mention, John, when the black men came to enlist with the U.S. Army at Camp Nelson, they were joined by their families. So who had no status. Actually, their status was still as enslaved people, but they were considered refugees. So the Army did not know what to do with them. And even though their men enlisted and self-emancipated, that status was not granted to their families. And so they basically became refugees and squatted at Camp Nelson, right? And they basically set up refugee camps and huts around, some of the military structures. Unfortunately, starting in August of 1864, the U.S. Army issued these expulsion orders, and it's from the commandant of the camp, and he just didn't want to deal with them, right? He wanted to focus on military matters, and the refugees in his mind were a burden, and so I didn't want to feed them. I don't want to provide health and medical care for them, so I want to get them out. So they literally drove these people out by the bayonet. Wow. The worst incident happened in November of 1864 when 400 were driven from the camp, including, John, family members of black soldiers. 106 at least that we know of died because of exposure before the order was rescinded. Obviously, it's the darkest episode of Camp Nelson. We actually did a special luminaria to honor the people who lost their lives with this. But the reason why I bring that up, John, is because not only did they drive them out from camp, they burned their huts down. And so Dr. McBride determined that he was able. He talks about soil, right? And I think your guest would love to hear this, because this really clicked with me. And he said, in archaeology, people want to come out and they want to find objects, right? He's like, for archaeologists, we're looking at the soil, the difference in the soil, what we can find in the soil. And what he found out is, some huts were just burned by themselves because they could find the burned like nails and things like that, right? But what he did find, which makes more sense, was there was a huge collection of burned nails. And he's like, you know what that was? They stacked up the huts and they set one big fire. So we know, and there were also, John, there were jewelry and artifacts from the enslaved people, the refugees themselves, that were African, inspired in regards to the way they were they're ornamental, right? And so they were determined this was actually the refugee camp, the original refugee camp. And he was able to determine that by seeing the burned wood, burned soil, which became soil, and then the burned objects like the nails and other jewelry and items like that, right? And you can imagine all of us were like, oh my gosh, had no idea. And, and so he was able to answer some questions. I'd also say, John, the refugees had a different diet from the soldiers, right? The soldiers were eating, as you know, more beef products, of course, and flour and hardtack and things like that. It appears that the refugees were basically foraging for their own food, trading and things like that. So you saw more pork and other poultry items like chickens, because by the bones, right? So he found all these different bones as well. And then I mentioned one last thing, John. You could see even in war, there's this pretty dramatic trade network that continues, right? And so that sutler shop being there, he found dozens of sardine cans that came from France, believe it or not. France. Wow. Yeah, and he found the company that made them, and it's incredible. So, these were sealed cans, and the soldiers, there was a lot of civilians at the camp as well that, did work there and things like that. Whoever bought the can, they would cut it open, they would eat the sardine, and they just chucked them on the ground. So it was people's trash, that just piled up over the years. in the soil and stuff, and he was able to find that stuff. So as you can imagine, it's absolutely spectacular. So yeah.
Wow. What has that been like, Steve, with dark moments like that, like the expulsion order and things like that? What has that been like from an interpretive standpoint? How do you confront those things? Because you don't want to hide it
Right.
at all. It's history, good, bad, or ugly. And
Exactly.
how do you utilize that in an interpretive sense to tell the truth about those kind of policies?
Well, that's a really great point, John, and that's a great question, and that's something that we work on all the time here. In regards to our social media posts, our website articles that talk about these experiences, and then when we do public programming, we've had one major public program, and it was the Luminario, right, in remembrance of the people that died because of the expulsion, and we put out 102 luminaries for the lives that were lost, and then we put 2 additional ones as well for the people that died trying to make it to camp, right? The ones that died from perhaps previous expulsions. But this gets back to your other earlier point, John, collaboration, right? We wanted to have the community involved, not only in the event, the planning of the event. And I really took that from, Marvin Greer, of the Hannibal Guard, great historian. I remember him saying, he wrote a post about this. He's like, because they're a very dynamic African-American living history group, as represent USCT and all these other units of Black soldiers. And he's like, we often get called out to do events and things like that. But, they don't even want to compensate us, right? They don't want us a part of the planning process. He's like, we need to be a part of that. And I'm like, that always stuck with me, right? And so, the superintendent and I, we met with community members, including African-American church members, pastors that were in the area, this African-American woman that has really done tremendous work. And she's become a good friend of ours. And she's kind of a representative of what we call the Care Council. We actually just had a meeting with them from the entire county, which includes educators, people that work in the library, right? People that are just involved in the community, right? And so we brought her in, and she came to the park, and we're like, hey, we're going to do this event, and we'd appreciate if you had any insight or any ideas and things like that. And so, John, we were just going to do the luminary, right? We're going to have the candles lit up, in the bags, and probably do some sort of, formal interpretation. And she was the one that said, this should be a walk. She's like, you should get people walking out there, and we had this event in November, and it was pretty cold, as you can imagine. And obviously we didn't want to replicate, there's no way you can replicate the horrors of that scene, but it was in that right setting. Right. And so she's the one that suggested the memorial walk. And then she also said, you need to include some music, some gospel music. Right. And so she invited some of her church members out, and they sang gospel music, music from the African-American church, even from that period as well, slavery music in many sense, and so to get them involved and very much involved in the planning process and the execution of it was very, very special for us. And so that's one of the reasons, we did that way. And we'd love to take, credit for doing the walk and then the singing, but that was all these church members and these other organizations, right? And so that was a big experience for us, a very important, provide a lot of insight for us moving forward, right? But I'll tell you this, John. I mean, I think you understand that, and it's so important to collaborate, but we're not shy about these stories either, right?
Right.
I mean, this is, it's one of those things where it's kind of very interesting. Sometimes there's not a happy ending, right? Even for all the African-American men that enlisted and were self-emancipated here, there were hundreds that tried to come to the camp or other camps around Kentucky that were murdered on the way to enlist and self-emancipate, right? And obviously the status of their families did not change until literally the end of the war. March of 1865 is when Congress passed legislation emancipating the families of Black soldiers, right? And then I'd also mention, John, I think people forget this because I know Juneteenth Day is a very important federal holiday, and I know people celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, as they should. There were still enslaved people in Kentucky and Delaware until the passage of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865, long after the Civil War, right? Or months after the major hostilities ended. So those are the conversations that we're trying to have with people, right? And as I mentioned, John, people are like, man, where did all those buildings go? Gone. Spring, summer of 1866, gone. And so you have all these African Americans that were on site. What happens to them? Because in 1865, they actually create the home for colored refugees here, which includes, and check out our images on our website and on our social media pages. And it was wooden houses. There was a hospital. There were schools, and there was white teachers that came down from the north to educate these formerly enslaved people, right? And all that was taken down. So these people are once again displaced, right? And so this idea of having this Black community in Central Kentucky, it just didn't happen. There was a small group of mostly former soldiers and former refugees that purchased some property west of where the main camp was at, and that became the descendant community. And we actually have some acreage over there as a part of the National Monument. And there are still direct descendants of USCT soldiers that live in that community. We call it the Hall community. So so I think there's a lot to take from this site, right? There's a lot of very sad, dark, tragic moments, but obviously I think there's things that can inspire people as well, or especially continue the conversation. I think that's critically important.
Right. That's fantastic, because I was going to ask you about the demographics of the region. Did any of those descendants stick around after the war, which you answered that eloquently, and also the fact that we as historians often have our hearts broken when we read about the past. It's hardly ever a jolly occasion to read about conflict and read about times of conflict or times of civil strife. That's why we continue to want to learn about it, so you don't repeat. It's never a thing where you just study history to be happy all the time. You wish you could be, but most of the time you're going to be like let down at what some people have done in the past, inspired by what others have done.
Absolutely.
And the Camp Nelson story touches all those bases, it seems like, where you see some people who could have done better, and you see some people who were doing their best and trying to understand what the idea of freedom is, and the idea of what America was supposed to be to certain people. It's a fascinating story that's almost a timeless story. It's something we've been talking about since the colonies.
Absolutely. Since the founding of the country in many ways, right? And that conversation continues to this day. And as we approach the 250th of the founding of this country, I think these conversations are even more pertinent right now. They're relevant. And so one of the things I actually have written in my office is relevancy, right? And that's what, I like myself to focus on, and my staff as well, sharing relevant stories, making this park relevant to, visitors from all over the country and world that come out to the site, right? And so that's what we're aiming to do, John. So I appreciate your insight as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's fantastic. It really is. I want to get a couple comments and questions.
Yeah, please.
Ronald's back again with Dr. McBride published in the Smithsonian is found of bottles of bear grease used for grooming soldiers' hair.
That's right.
That's cool.
And they also, for guys with lighter hair, they also had dye, so they could, get their hair lighter for the images they took at the photography shop at Camp Nelson, which he shared with us the other day. I almost forgot about just dozens of glass bottles of everything from like beer to wine, of course, to chemicals that they use in the Photoshop and things like that. Yeah, you could find everything.
Cool. That's cool. David has a great question. Was that event filmed, Steve, that you did for?
I see Mr. Scar's comment about the. I think he's talking about the expulsion. We filmed. It was a pretty long event, Mr. Scar. It was almost 2 hours long. We did film it, but we're still in the process of editing that. So just give us a little bit more time. I would suggest, sir, that you go to our park website. We have an entire section about the expulsion. Just go on to learn more about the park. And then go to the history and culture section, and you're going to find it. So actually, John, if you don't mind, I'm going to put it in the
chat there.
Yeah.
I'll throw it up there. I placed the park site in chat, but I can place anything you want in chat as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that, my friend.
Yeah.
But yeah, here we go. John, if you could share that.
Absolutely.
That takes them directly to and you can see the luminaries we did as well.
Okay, I have it here. And I'll get another question here out of, let me get back to comments. So many buttons to push, my friends. So many buttons. Garrett is in here. Here we go, Garrett. Steve, like Freedmen's Village in Arlington, was Camp Nelson and the later sites where these self-emancipated individuals become under management of the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands.
Yes, and this is what you were talking about, John. This is the disappointing part. The Freedmen's Bureau accelerated the closing of the park. I mean, of the camp, actually. And, you know, a lot of these people didn't want to leave. They had nowhere to go, right? And so, especially since the government allocated so much manpower and funds to build, especially the home for colored refugees, right? Which include dozens of cottages, as I said, all these other structures like schools, a kitchen, and also a hospital as well. But as you can imagine, Garrett, people in Central Kentucky did not want this Black community forming in this area here. And so Camp Nelson was slowly dismantled beginning in 1866, beginning of the year. And by the summer, it was gone. Can you imagine that? Every single one of these structures was taken down, right? Wow. And so thankfully, there were some forward-thinking people that were involved with this, including a reverend who founded Berea College in Kentucky named John G. Fee. He was an abolitionist, and him and his wife basically purchased a lot of land where the home for colored refugees was, and then they later sold parcels of land to those former refugees that wanted to stay in that area. And so that's the descendant community that we have today, relatively small, as I said. The park owns about 7 acres on that side of the highway, west of the US 27 in the Hall community. And we also, that includes the Fee Memorial Church, which was the second church that was built there, I think in 1911. But I'll tell you this, Garrett, majority of people left. You know, they either returned back to where they're enslaved to do labor work. A lot of them went north and crossed the Ohio River into Ohio. Listen to this. Some of them that we know that tried to stay around Central Kentucky, it was just so hard in the post-war era to really make a living, right? And obviously the racial animosity was just accelerated. So there was a group that left in the 1870s to go west to, start homesteads. The famous exodusters that I think people have heard of starting in 1877, yep. Nicodemus and all that. Some of them came from Camp Nelson. Wow. So we also have a direct connection to Nicodemus National, I believe, historic site or monument. But that's a question. No, that's a great question. A lot of people ask us, like, I can't believe they took everything down so quickly. It's like, yeah, that happened. And so I think unlike the defenses of Washington and D.C., as he mentioned, Freedmen's Village, a lot of these African-Americans were able to kind of stay in that area and end up purchasing property, right? The majority of the ones in Camp Nelson had to go, unfortunately.
Liz is in the chat. Liz would absolutely want to know this question. I would like to know it from a more generic standpoint.
Sure.
Liz is going for the photography studio for obvious reasons because Liz is into the photography. So we could touch on that too. But are there plans to, over the years to come, to start recreating any of the structures, including?
Great question. And I think we're going to not necessarily, we can't rebuild buildings in a sense in the Park Service anymore just because of the cost of it. But that said, so there was as I said, there was 300 structures here, wooden structures. For like the bakery, John, we want to set up like big flour barrels. The foundation of is still there. Obviously, we're going to have new interpretive waysides, including, I think, tactile stations that, that are kind of 3D that you can touch and things like that. Right. We have a lot of images, I said, of the camp. So those will be incorporated, of course. But Liz, I'd love to, recreate any of the buildings, but I think there's going to be symbolically some structures that go up. So you're going to see flour barrels for the bakery, for the prison. I'd love to see us to put up one of the guard towers, right? There was 4 guard towers and this large, I guess, rectangle-ish or square. And so that might go up as well. Oh, let me share this. Okay. Everything. And so that's what I really enjoyed about being in this position, John, is, I take on more responsibilities and do new things, right? Including getting funding for projects. And, me and my big cannons, it looks like we're going to get 2 cannons two reproduction cannons at one of our sites. And so, I would also share the county Dr. McBride excavated the site of one of the forts here, actually. And he found the nails. He found the revetment posts that reinforced the walls. And the county rebuilt the fort. It's amazing.
Wow.
And so, it's been rebuilt. They've got the wooden platforms. And we're actually going to replace the wooden platforms and the revetments because they've eroded over the past 20 years. But we're going to have a 12-pound Napoleon and a 30-pound Parrott rifle posted at the fort. So, yes. There's a lot more coming. And then obviously we still have, I'd also share for Liz and everyone else. There is one, I guess there's two historic structures, but only one from the Civil War. It's called the Oliver Perry House or the White House. Everyone sees it as you drive past the park or into the parking lot. It was used as officers' quarters during the Civil War. We need major renovations, Sean. I mean, we're just doing stabilization so the building doesn't basically collapse on itself. But, we did some, we had to kind of seal the roof because there's a lot of leaks and water going in. We're actually going to scrape off all the bad paint and just put a new paint job on it this summer. But we're also, in 2000, and we're looking ahead, right? 2023, 24, 25, even 26, we got big projects in the works to, renovate that. We're going to interpret it as officers' quarters. But we're also, my friends, working on a new park film. We're also working on new park exhibits and then obviously new waysides as well. So you can imagine for us interp crazy people, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Right? It's such a unique opportunity. So, and also as well, we've acquired more land. So we're developing trail systems as well. Wow. So there's going to be more trails going south of, actually we're going through where the main heart of the camp, the industrial part is. And so, John, I just can't reiterate how exciting this is. We're building literally a brand new national park, right? And it's incredibly exciting. And, I think people come in this career, especially in the Park Service, people, you work at a park or site for 2 or 3 years and you kind of move on. But I think for a lot of us here, we're going to be here a while because we have a lot to do.
Yeah, this is years of
absolutely.
Probably at least a generation. Probably of this. I mean, you're at the forefront, you're on the front line, and the county has done so much already.
They have, right?
But with the interpretive model, that's a generational thing where you're starting it, but it may not be over for a while.
Right. And I'd share, it's, as I said, one of the things that we say a lot, John, is often in the park we say this is a first, right? And let me give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, we had our first full staff employee meeting. That's the first time it's ever happened in the history of Camp Nelson, right? Which was incredibly exciting, right? Like, this is so cool. Right. We had our first education program this past year, and then we got more coming up. These first formal programs, all this stuff. It's just been really cool to do all these firsts in the park. And as you mentioned, we're making decisions that will affect the park for decades, and we understand that, right? So we're, we want to be forward thinking and be very comprehensive in our approach to do this, right? And so we're working with a lot of different people to do that. And I'd share as well, other things that we're working on. I think things that we take for granted when we go to national park sites or even historic sites, right? John, the Unigrid, the park brochure, we're literally doing that right now, right? I'm working on the text for that actually tomorrow. I'm working on the draft for it tomorrow, and then I have a meeting with someone at the Harpers Ferry Center, right? And so you can imagine, oh my gosh, my friend, this is exciting. There's nowhere else I'd want to be right now, to be honest with you. So,
no, I love it because I love interpretation, and so you're molding this out of clay.
Absolutely,
this beautiful piece of art over time. It's not like it has to be done tomorrow, like the whole thing. It's and patience always prevails with it, but you also want to try to touch as many bases as you can. I've used that before, but you want to be able to check the boxes and keep some boxes available because there's something else going to be written in later.
Yeah, and I'd say before we answer more questions, it's that's such a great point, and I think we're very cognizant of that, right? And as I mentioned, it's to be engaged in this type of work is incredibly exciting because, when you go to other parks that have been around for 50 up to 100 years, they've got like an established culture, a way of doing things, right? They've already had their first, right? And you kind of evolve and build in a certain way. But here you're right. This really is clay that we're molding with our own hands. And oh my gosh, it's exciting. So what other questions do we have there, John? Or comments?
We have let's see here. We have there'd be some good Eagle Scout projects.
Oh, absolutely. It's funny he says that. We have a group from AmeriCorps, a bunch of young people. They actually were here last year when I was on detail and we did some earthwork restoration. They're coming back on Saturday. So we got some earthwork stuff going on Saturday.
There you go. There you go. Kitty, yes, this will be, I guess you're talking about this one. This one will be available. And you have a friend whose ancestors were among the refugee families. That's amazing. So
I'm sorry, what was that?
Will this Zoom event be accessible late? Do you see it there, Steve? For reviewing and sharing? I have a friend whose ancestors were among the refugee families.
Oh my gosh.
That's awesome. You definitely direct them to the website as well.
Yeah, and if you could put my email in the chat, I'd love to hear from that person with the ancestor. That'd be incredible.
Yes, I can put that in there.
Because we have, we know of descendants of a lot of the soldiers, of course, but obviously the refugees themselves, we don't know that much about, unfortunately. But to have a descendant of a refugee would be something that we'd love to hear more about or hear from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that personal story and being able to connect families with their ancestors in that way is just tremendous, especially when it's refugees and that kind of a thing where their story may not have been told before in the way you're going to be telling.
Right.
And that's huge.
Well, and I'd also mention, John, I think a lot of sites and obviously historians have been talking about like contraband camps, right?
Right.
Obviously enslaved people that came into federal lines, were considered contraband of war, right? Property, because they were considered property by the Confederacy. This is not the case in Kentucky, which is really interesting, right? Because, contrabands, I know Garrett was talking about Freedmen's Village. And I saw this in the Defenses of Washington, right? When enslaved people came in from Virginia, they were accepted in the federal lines. But if they came from Maryland, it was like, oh, I don't know about this, because Maryland was a border state. It was not in rebellion, right?
Right.
And so I had a lot of experience that reading a lot of accounts, especially from soldiers who experienced this and saw this on the ground in DC. That happens every single day in Kentucky, right? And so you've got these people that are self-emancipating or attempting to self-emancipate. They're not contrabands when they come to the federal camps. They're refugees or they're fugitive slaves, I guess you could say, to be honest. I mean, technically they are. But by 1864, the Army, especially if you're a fit and able man, we're going to recruit you in, and then you're emancipated. But I think you make a great point, John. The status of the refugees was not cleared up until 1865.
Yeah, it's one of those. It's one of those stories that it just didn't have an end for so long, where it wasn't defined, and it was almost like commanders in the field could kind of go whichever direction they felt like going at the time until there was something else. Ronald comes up with a great question too here before we wrap up in a little bit. Steve, you talk about the negative reactions of Kentuckians when enrolling former slaves in early 1864.
Absolutely, and it was profound how negative the reaction was. It was. So I actually went to this really cool Civil War presentation recently. It was about a Kentuckian soldier that became commander of the District of Columbia named Stephen Burbridge. And by the way, he's a native Kentuckian. He's a slaveholder, but he also enforced federal policy as well, and especially the enforcement of the recruitment of Black soldiers. So, Ronald, there was vehement protest from Kentuckians. There were a lot of white Kentuckian officers that resigned their commissions. And I also think about this. Kentucky voted for George McClellan. That's how upset they were with emancipation. Okay.
That's right.
So what I loved about this story, because, I had to steal this from him. There were conditional unionists. And that's why, Kentucky was a border state, because they were they believed that staying in the Union was the best way to preserve the institution of slavery. Obviously, the war will change that. And so when, they were furious when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Even though it didn't affect Kentucky, they knew it was coming. Something was coming, right? And so when that happened, they're like, we don't support Lincoln in the administration anymore. We're going to support George McClellan because he said he wasn't going to touch slavery, right? And there was unconditional unionists as well, right? The people including Stephen Burbridge, that said, we have to prosecute this war, any way we can. And if that means destroying slavery, we're going to do it. And then I'd also mention as well, Ronald, by 1864, due to emancipation especially, you're going to have a dramatic rise in guerrilla activity throughout the state of Kentucky, targeted not only against African Americans, which is obviously one of their main objectives, but also unionists as well, and to cause havoc throughout the state. And then I'd mention one more thing. Kentucky knew this was coming. State leaders, they resisted this. They saw it coming, but they tried to compromise with the federal government as well. And they said this, okay, if you are going to enlist men, black men, you have to compensate them like you did when you wanted their labor to build roads and fortifications. And the Army's like, all right, we can do that. They also said this, they cannot wear federal uniforms and they cannot be trained in the state of Kentucky. Because the sight of black men in uniform, like, we can't have that, right? So can you believe that? And so the Army was just like, I don't know. By 1864, as I said, all chips were on the table and the Army recruited against the protest of Kentuckians. So one of the reasons why there's this dramatic turn in kind of this sentiment, lost cause sentiment in Kentucky, the memory of the war, right, is because of emancipation. That's how many Kentuckians were against emancipation. And so let me give you a final thought here, John.
Yeah.
Over 120,000 men served in the U.S. military in Kentucky during the Civil War, from Kentucky, including 23,000 black men, okay? I think the number is about 35,000 served in the Confederacy, so it's not very close, right? But it was all about, their sentiment, their loyalty was hinged on emancipation. And once emancipation happened, kind of the floodgates opened, right? And this is what we have here today in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I mentioned one final thing.
Yeah.
Sorry. We talked about the 13th Amendment, ratifying in December of 1865, obviously ending slavery in the final two across the country, but also especially Kentucky and Delaware. Kentucky did not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1976. Okay, think about that.
Wow.
Right? It's insane, right? Just to think about that. But it's really interesting, how the war is remembered in Kentucky, and that's one of the things that we contend with.
And I've seen it come up in chat about lost cause stuff as well. That's in the post-war period. What you brought up with this, it ignites this lost cause mentality after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the war, Reconstruction, and such. With the numbers that you brought up, it's a lot like Maryland. And you would think today that Maryland was a Confederate state. Like I've actually met people who have said, yeah, it was a border state, but 3 times as many people fought for the Confederacy as the Federal Army. And I'm like, no, it's actually almost the opposite,
Right.
when you look at the numbers. And it's like the whole Reconstruction era, the implications of the lost cause narrative have changed our perceptions as who is fighting on whose side in greater numbers in these border states like Kentucky, like Maryland.
Right.
And as someone like me who has an ancestor who fought for the Union from Maryland, it was kind of like that was seen as almost the norm around that area. It's entirely flipped. And that's a great point that you bring up, and one that is really interesting to me because Kentucky seems like it's no different.
Yeah, it's so absolutely, John. That's such a great insight and point there. So I was talking about Burbridge, right? So the new book that came out is called like The Most Hated Man in Kentucky. And the reason why he was vilified in the post-war press, including by former Confederate officers, believe it or not, who came back to Kentucky, right, was because of emancipation. He enforced emancipation. Okay, I mean, he enforced the enlistment of black soldiers, which led to their emancipation, right? And he also went after Confederate guerrillas as well, right? And so, the title of the book includes the lost cause as well, right? And it's got the lost cause in the memory of General Stephen Burbridge, and it's very pertinent. And I thought his argument was really straight on, because if you read the primary source material, they wanted to get rid of him because he was enlisting black soldiers. Which is really, really interesting, right? And I'll share one more thing, John. If people want to learn more about Camp Nelson from like a historian perspective or even an academic perspective, there is a phenomenal book about actually Black refugees going through these camps during the Civil War. And John, I'm going to share it with you really quick. And if you could share it to the viewers here.
Yeah.
So Dr. Amy Taylor wrote the book called Embattled Freedoms, like a journey through the Civil War's slave refugee camps. She actually dedicates an entire chapter to Camp Nelson. And we're very fortunate, John, because she works at the University of Kentucky. So she's in Lexington, right up the road from us. And some of her students have worked at our park. And actually, she's going to be speaking at our Winter Lecture Series in March. So obviously, we're thrilled to have her. Yes. But I think that's someone that we should connect with, John, and we should have her on your program as well. She's that incredible. So
yeah, that'd be fantastic. I actually interviewed her for one of my 10-minute interviews at the CWI Summer Conference a few years back when she came out with them.
Oh, right, yeah, okay.
So it'd be great to actually have a long discussion, and
definitely
her about that. That'd be fantastic.
And then she's also, she has her students working on research related to some of the Black soldiers that were organized here, including, I think, the 5th and 6th U.S. Colored Cav. There weren't many Black cavalry units, but there was 2 of them that were here. And so, John, if there's no more questions, I'd love to. I'm free. So, is there any more questions or comments? I'd love to.
Just people saying about how they thank us for the great discussion, and this was great. All good stuff, all good comments coming our way. So please.
Well, I appreciate that. Please go and like our Facebook page. We've got events on there. We've got a lot of really cool posts about Camp Nelson, everything. I call it Civil War Kentucky, of course, everything related to that. Obviously, check out our website, my friends. There's a lot to learn there. And you have my email address as well. So be happy to hear from any of you if you've got any questions or comments, or if you're planning to come out to Kentucky and check out Camp Nelson. I'd love to show you around. So, I'm at, services our name, right? So I'm at their service, Sean. And as ever, my friend, I love you very much, and I appreciate all you do. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I love you, man. And I hope that I can get to Kentucky soon. I haven't wanted to go to Kentucky so bad in my life, but now I want to hang out a while and see the site and maybe do some live stuff there with you. And,
yeah, that would be great.
Plug some of the upcoming trails and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think it'd be cool if we can kind of keep people updated about the transformation of the park. As we continue to develop new projects and install new things. I think people would really enjoy that. So
yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Yeah, love you, man. Whatever you need from me, just let me know. Okay.
Appreciate it. I appreciate everyone tuning in tonight, watching Steve and I discuss this very, very important topic and this new site that everyone should go check out. I've placed links in the comment section. We have books in the comment section. We got it all rolling over here. Thank you to everybody on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter for being with us tonight. And Steve, thank you, brother, for being here. Really appreciate you, man.
Always a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you soon, my friend.
Yeah, man. Everyone, please take care of yourself. Be healthy. Be good to yourself.
Stay safe.
Stay safe. We will see you all very soon.